Good afternoon, everyone. It is Wednesday, December 7th, 2022 at 3 o'clock p.m., which means it is time for Women in Business. Now, we're doing a little different topic today than what we normally cover, and that is because of a question that was asked to me last week. Last week, I did a show on dealing with the holiday blues, and one of the comments that was made during that show by someone who was watching was forgiveness and dealing with forgiveness and how that's hard. And I went off on kind of a segue about forgiveness and what I thought that meant and all that. And it started me thinking, and I thought, this is an interesting topic, particularly from a female perspective, because oddly enough, forgiveness seems to be connected with or conflated with, depending on which terminology you want to use, being female. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that and a little bit about why that is and historically why that is, and then what forgiveness actually means and what when you forgive someone you are voluntarily doing and what maybe you don't have to do in order to forgive someone and why you might want to forgive someone. So it's a pretty wide-ranging topic. There's a lot of different aspects to cover here, but I think it's interesting, and I think it's interesting definitely from the standpoint of how forgiveness has kind of become a female province, that forgiveness is kind of a female thing in a way. And I think that's weird. And I want to start there because where that came from, a lot of it anyway, is that historically women were always kind of linked or centered with peace and sweetness and kindness and benevolence and all these things. Women were not historically the warmongers. The warmongers were the men. The men were the ones that went out and fought. The women were the ones who stayed home and nurtured the house and took care of the kids and did all that stuff. And so I think from the standpoint of ease, if nothing else, it was just easier to kind of say. Plus, women were also the ones who didn't have a lot of agency back in the day. And back in the day could be, 100 years ago, could be 300 years ago, could be 1,000 years ago. Women didn't have, for a long swath of history, any mechanism to exact any revenge, really. Now, granted, there are Greek myths and things where women do horrendous things. I mean, Medea killed her children. Medusa was a gorgon and could turn people to stone. So there were women who had agency, but in the main, women didn't. So what happened was, out of basically having no other recourse, forgiveness and creation of peace became kind of womanly virtues, so to speak. Women were the peaceful ones. Women were the ones who were about forgiveness and benevolence and being sweet and being kind and being all that stuff. Now, there actually is, and this is funny because I knew this a little, but I didn't really know the extent of it. Part of the duties of being a queen back in medieval times was to be the peacemaker. And when a situation erupted where the king was potentially going to go to war with someone or perhaps execute someone or do something heinous and horrible, there would be this actual big ceremony where the queen would come in finely dressed and wearing her crown. She would kneel in front of the king on his throne, and she would beg him to please not do whatever he was doing. Please make peace. Please don't kill this person. Please don't, commit genocide on this population, whatever he was going to do. And then he would, out of love for her, or that was the kind of formula that they used. Out of love and affection for his queen, he would then not do the thing. Now, anybody who has a modicum of intelligence would go, okay, so it's a setup. He doesn't really want to do the thing. He doesn't want to start the war. He doesn't want to kill the person, but he looks weak if he decides not to do it on his own. So they did this set piece of theater where the queen comes in and she cries and she looks fragile and sweet, and the king says, out of love for you, I will not do this thing that you're asking me not to do. His face is saved, the bad event doesn't happen, everybody is happy and can go on with their day. Now, this kind of thing, without granted the theatrics, happened for centuries and centuries. Women were the peacemakers. Women were the ones who created hearth and home. They kept things nice. They kept things good. And part of that became they also forgave. They didn't hold grudges. They didn't start wars. They didn't start fights. They didn't do that stuff. Women didn't do that. And it also ended up becoming a little bit of a weapon against women, that you weren't ladylike if you wanted revenge. You weren't ladylike if you didn't forgive. You weren't ladylike if you felt that you had been harmed and you deserved to be recompensed for that harm. And so a lot of heinous things were done to women, and they were told that if you are a true woman, if you are a true person of peace, that you will forgive this thing. And a lot of heinous stuff was forgiven. Now, granted, like I said earlier, these women had no recourse. They couldn't take the perpetrator to court. Even still today, in certain cases, if you report someone, you may not be believed. You may be made a victim again because your whole life and sexual history and whatever it is will be raked over the coals again. So in a lot of cases, women adopted forgiveness as a virtue on their own because it was too hard to deal with any other consequence, or to deal with the fact that they had no other thing they could do. So it's like when you're poor and you make a virtue out of the fact that you can make dinner out of anything, like you have ketchup and saltines and that's dinner. And it's not a great thing and it doesn't really benefit you, but you make a virtue out of it because you have no choice. And that was kind of what women did with forgiveness a little bit, is we had no other recourse. We couldn't go to anyone and get satisfaction. For a long time within the history of the world, and certainly the history of the US, women couldn't sue, they couldn't own property, they couldn't have custody of their children. They had nothing they could do except forgive the trespasses that were made against them. So that's the first thing I want to talk about, is this whole idea of women as the benevolent sex, women as the people who are about peace and about forgiveness and who bring those qualities to others. And it started, like I said, back in the medieval days when the queen would entreat the king not to do this horrible thing. And it was all just a big face-saving bit of theatrics so that he could probably not do something he didn't want to do anyway. So I think that's an interesting place to start, because a lot of people, and then it all grew into, to forgive is divine and all this kind of stuff. And forgiveness became this enshrined thing that was supposed to make you a better person and was supposed to make you more benevolent and was supposed to make you more, I don't know, good, I guess is the word. And what really is bothersome about this is it became not about repentance and forgiveness. Excuse me, my nose was running there for a minute. It just became about forgiveness. So forgiveness was eventually supposed to be bestowed upon the person who had transgressed, whether or not they had done anything worthy of being forgiven. And that's the bit that was forgotten. And so that kind of led to this weird sort of weaponizing of forgiveness, where you were criticized if you didn't say you forgave someone, where you were told that you weren't good if you didn't forgive people, that you were expected to forgive people whether or not they'd made amends or they understood what they'd done or anything. And that led to this kind of what I call toxic forgiveness, which is where you, maybe not in your heart, but just to get along or to make things functional, you say, I forgive you. And that's not of benefit to anyone because the person who's being forgiven may not merit forgiveness. And the person who's doing the forgiving may not feel that they want to forgive the person. And I also think, and I want to talk about this for a minute, that what we think forgiveness means has become kind of skewed over the years. Now, I found this definition of forgiveness, and it's one of the best I've ever seen, and I really, really like it. And that is that forgiveness is, and I want to read this to make sure I get it right, an intentional decision to let go of resentment and anger. Now, that version of forgiveness I can totally get behind. And here's why. Because it is forgiveness as a release for the person who's been harmed. It's letting go of toxic emotions that were caused by an event that happened to you so you can move on and have a better life. Notice in this definition, there is nothing about accepting the person who transgressed in your life back into your life. There is nothing about making them feel better. There is nothing about you're a good person if you forgive. There is nothing about making the person who did the thing to you or caused the event that hurt you feel like they're a good person. It's simply about letting go of toxic emotions that would otherwise harm you or get in the way of you having a happy life. Now, let's contrast that with the kind of skewed definition of forgiveness that seems to be prevalent in a lot of places. And that definition of forgiveness is basically when you forgive someone, you're giving them a blank check and absolving them of any responsibility for what they did, any harm they caused you, and you're basically just giving them a blanket pass that they don't have to say they're sorry, they don't have to change the behavior, they don't have to make up for what they did, they just get a blanket pass. I forgive you. You are now absolved. Go and sin no more. And I was going to make the Catholic sign of the cross, except I don't know which way it goes. Not religious. So what forgiveness became instead was basically, you hurt me, but I'm giving you a free pass. Or you caused, pain in my life, or you caused damage or whatever you did, but I'm giving you a free pass. You don't have to do anything to merit it. I'm just going to give it to you. And so what happened is a lot of people were pressured to forgive things that hadn't been fixed, no one had made amends for. It was just kind of like, yeah, you got hurt, suck it up and tell me it's okay. That's what forgiveness kind of became. And that, I think, is way more toxic than not forgiving someone, honestly. If you negate your own pain, if you negate your own feelings, if you negate what happened to you so you can make somebody else feel better, that's just not right. I'm sorry, it's just not. But that's kind of what we're told, is that forgiveness is this panacea, this cure-all that's going to make everything better. And what generally happens in a lot of cases is you say you forgive someone and they feel better because they got a free pass, but you don't feel better because you're still angry about the thing. You're still resentful about what happened. You're still hurt by what happened. And nobody's done anything to make you feel better about it. So I like the definition of forgiveness that involves letting go of resentment or anger because I think that is positive and valuable. And what I like about this definition the most is it doesn't say you accept the behavior. It doesn't say you'll allow the behavior to continue. It doesn't say you excuse the behavior. It just says, I'm letting go of negative emotions about what you did so I can move on with my life. And that I think, and sorry, I got to grab a drink here because you can hear the voices going a little raspy. And that I think is a much healthier way to forgive people. And honestly, when I saw this definition, I went, oh, because I will say this is the way that I have proceeded with a lot of people in my life is trying to let go of anger and resentment I have, trying to feel as much as I can compassion for them and trying to understand why they did what they did at whatever time they did it. Now, arguably, there are some people this has been easier with than others, but the value to my life of doing that was huge because I spent a lot of my early adulthood, my late teens and early 20s, being really resentful of a lot of people because I felt like gotten a raw deal and I felt like I'd been really hurt and a lot of people had, done heinous things to me and nobody had said they were sorry and nobody had tried to make amends and nobody even really seemed to care. And I just was like, I want this acknowledged. I am a person and I deserve to have my pain acknowledged. And I would carry my pain so closely and I would pull it out and exhibit it to people basically as like, look, I've been hurt. See, shouldn't people care about this? And honestly, everybody's got their traumas. Everybody's got the things that hurt them. And when I got a little smarter and a little further in the work that I've been doing, I realized that, okay, the people that hurt me, they don't care. Obviously, they don't care because they hurt me. So my hating them or being angry at them or being sad about them or whatever it is not impacting them at all, but it's screwing up my life hugely. So there's no point to that. And that is when I let my anger and resentment go. That is when I tried to learn to be more compassionate. That's when I tried to understand why maybe those people did what they did. Now, that doesn't mean that I took them all back in my life. That doesn't mean that they got a pass on what they did. That doesn't mean that I made excuses for them or that what I thought they did suddenly was right. It just means that I said, I am letting go of these toxic emotions about these events. And what happened was once I did that, I stopped thinking about those things as much. I stopped obsessing about how I'd been hurt and why I'd been hurt and what it was about me that made people want to treat me that way. And I stopped obsessing about the people who'd done those things. I didn't care what they thought anymore. I didn't care what they felt anymore. I just didn't care because I'd let it go. And that's a version of forgiveness I can get behind, a version that serves you, a version that helps you get rid of toxic emotions that are maybe getting in the way of you having the happiest life you want to have. And I think that's a version of forgiveness that serves everyone, really, because it doesn't let the people who transgressed off the hook, but it gives them their freedom too. because you're not thinking about them anymore. They can go on and do whatever they want to do. Now, you would hope that they would learn from what they did and understand what they did, and we'll talk about that a little later. That's a whole separate thing, and that's really not about forgiveness. That's about them. But it's kind of like some, new age books will say you should do an exercise where you sit in there's two chairs and you sit in one chair, and in the other chair you envision someone you want to forget, and you recite whatever it is that they did, and then you say, and I forgive you and I let you go, or write a letter and do the same thing. And the gist behind that, and I think what really matters there, is the I let you go part. I'm not going to obsess about you anymore. I'm not going to give you agency in my life. I am not going to think about what you did. I am going to go on and have the happiest life I can, and you're not going to be a part of it, and that's how it's going to be. And I think there is some value in that. And I think that's part of what this definition does. If you let go of resentment and anger, you're also pretty much letting go of the event and the person. You're freeing yourself to move on to other things. And you would be surprised, and I've talked about this before. There's such a thing as what I call the tragedy Olympics, which is where people hoard their pain and their tragedies and their sadness, and they kind of compare it to see who had the worst story, or who had the worst time, or who has the most pain, or whatever it is. And it's almost like there's a theory that there's going to be a gold medal, or there's going to be an award at the end, that the person who has the worst story is going to get a prize of some kind. I don't know what that prize would be. But again, it's, if you're not forgiving, if you're not letting go of the resentment and anger, then you're obsessing about it. Then it's still dictating your life and your actions and what you do and how you behave and how you feel and how you think. And that's just causing more damage. And honestly, one of my driving mantras when I was a kid, and this is weird, I know, but it was, is they're not going to win. Because I felt like I had so many negative pieces of information and happenings and things coming at me all the time. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to survive this. I'm going to become the person I want to be. They're not going to win. Now, okay, that's a little melodramatic, but hey, I was a melodramatic kid. Ask my parents, they would tell you. I'm probably still a little melodramatic as an adult, but it was also something that drove me for a long time, which was kind of a fuel of, you're not right. I'm going to have my revenge. I'm going to triumph over all this stuff. Now, eventually, I learned to let go of my anger and resentment. I learned to have compassion for the people who had done some of these things to me. I learned to understand why they did them. And I learned to move on and become the person that I really wanted to be, instead of the person that was shaped by those events. That, I think, is the value of forgiveness. Now, honestly, I don't really like the word forgiveness. I'm not a huge fan. But I will say that I think there is value to letting go of your resentment and anger. And if you want to call that forgiveness, I think that's a good thing. I think forgiveness has become a catch-all term for a lot of behaviors that are basically letting people weasel out of the responsibility for bad things that they have done. And yes, this is another point that I want to make, because I think this is something that we also fail to take into account sometimes. You can do hurtful or negative or bad things to someone else with the most benevolent intentions in the world, with the best intentions in the world. You could be struggling with your own demons or problems or issues or whatever, and you're acting out of those, and you do harm to someone else. You don't get to decide if they were harmed. You don't get to decide if it was bad. You don't get to decide if you deserve forgiveness or not. That is on the person who feels that they were damaged, who has experienced something you did as a negative thing. That's on them. What you do have the right to do is apologize, explain, and as the person who is doing the forgiving, hopefully you have the ability to understand that sometimes people do harmful and hurtful things from the best of motives. Doesn't mean it's right. Doesn't mean that you should give it a pass. Just means that not everyone is a supervillain. Sometimes people do things that are very scarring out of the best of motives. And I think once you can see that and have a little compassion for that, it makes it a lot easier to let go of your anger and resentment, because you can understand that this thing, whatever the thing is something that happened because of circumstances or because of demons that the person who did it was fighting at the time or issues that they had. And, we talk about things like generational trauma and stuff like that. That is all part of it too. Your parents and your grandparents and your aunts and uncles and your family friends and everybody is carrying their own set of wounds from things that happened to them. It would be lovely to think that we were all well adjusted and perfectly, set up to be parents and to be friends and to be spouses, but we're not. We're all carrying our own baggage and our own hurt. And I think when you forgive someone in the meaning of letting go of your resentment and anger, you can then look at the person with a much more compassionate gaze, and you can understand maybe some of the issues they were carrying. You can hope that will lead you to be able to really forgive them and really release them back to the wild so they can do whatever they want to do. I'm not going to say it's easy. I'm not going to say it's something that's going to happen in 5 seconds. Forgiveness, I think, is also a process. You have to make peace with what the event means in your own life. You have to make peace with what the person who caused the event means in your life. You have to make peace with who you ultimately want to be. And then you have to look at it all and go, okay, this is something that I can legitimately say I can let go of my resentment or anger. And sometimes you'll say, you know what? I'm not ready to do that yet. I need to be mad about this for a while longer. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's no timetable for this, even though people will try to tell you there's one. And people will try to, in a lot of recovery circles, forgiveness has become like this virtue. Like you've achieved growth when you forgive people, or, you're being a benevolent person when you forgive people. And it's like, you know what? I don't really feel the need to be benevolent to people who hurt me. I don't really feel the need to give them a pass. I don't feel that shows personal growth on my part. I think that's a step backwards, because you have the right to how you feel. You have the right to have your boundaries respected. You have the right to have your broken places or your damage or your pain or your uncomfortableness honored. And if people don't do that, then forgiving them is kind of a lost cause, because basically what you're saying is, I'm not worth being respected. And I think that's a hugely horrible message to send. Don't send that message. So let's talk about this for a second. How do you know when you should forgive someone? Or how do you know when someone is, I hate the word worthy, but it's the only word I can think of. How do you know when someone is worthy of forgiveness? How do you know when it's the right time to forgive someone? So let's talk about a few areas where you may find indicators. First thing, do they understand what they did? And this sounds like a silly question, but honestly, a lot of times it's not. Because people will do something that hurts you or makes you uncomfortable, and they'll think it's a joke, or they'll think you're overreacting, or they'll think that, it was relatively harmless, or hey, we all act like this, or whatever it is. And they won't have any understanding of why you're upset, or why you're angry, or why you're hurt. And so I think one plank of deciding if someone should be forgiven is, do they get what they did? Do they understand why it was not a good thing? Do they understand why you're upset about it? And this is a tougher thing than you would think sometimes, because a lot of things that one person would shrug off or say, that's not a big deal, another person may take very seriously. Um, a lot of things that some people would think are nothing, other people feel are really something horrible and sad. So you need to, if you can, and I understand this isn't always possible or desirable, you need to have a discussion with the person who did the thing or said the thing or created the event that caused the issue, and see if they get why you're upset. And I'm not necessarily advocating that if they don't get it, they shouldn't be forgiven, if we're using the definition of forgiveness that is letting go of resentment and anger. If we're using the more broad-based definition that I think most people would use today, which is they get a free pass and still get to be in your life and still get to be around you, then yeah, understanding what they did and why it matters to you is huge. Because if they don't understand it, if you're forgiving them for something that they may do again next week because they don't get why it matters to you, then you've pretty much just negated any boundaries you ever had. And boundaries are important, and your right to be respected is important. So if they don't get it, then you may want to rethink saying, I forgive you. You may not. I don't know. That's up to you, but I'm just saying. Second thing, are they sorry? Do they feel remorse? And I mean genuinely, do they feel remorse? Not as was done to me by someone at one point. If you think I have something to be sorry for, then I'm sorry. Which is the most half-assed, stupid apology I have ever, well, it wasn't really an apology, but the most half-assed, stupidest attempt at an apology I've ever had in my life. Which basically says, I don't think I did anything. I don't feel any remorse about this. But hey, to make a pseudo peace, I'm going to say, if you think I did anything, well, then I'm sorry. No, that does not fly. Are they genuinely remorseful? Do they understand that they caused harm in some way? And if you think I did something, I'm sorry, apology is one of the most weasel ways to try to make amends I really have ever heard in my life, honestly. It basically puts all the burden on the person who experienced the damage and basically says, I don't think I did anything, but if you think I did something, just for the purposes of, you know, creating peace, I'm going to say I'm sorry. but I really don't think I did anything. And granted, I think I'm sorry is another one of those kind of like forgiveness. It's another one of those things that's kind of used as a bandage or a patch over a wound that's like spewing blood. It's something that people say and sometimes don't mean. And it's kind of like, well, I know it's the old trope of the abusive husband who, beats up his wife and then he comes home with flowers and he says, "I'm sorry, honey, I'll never do it again." And she goes, "Okay." And then 3 weeks later, he beats her up again. There comes a point where sorry doesn't mean anything anymore, where it's just a word. And I think you need to be aware of that too. So, sorry or being sorry is also demonstrated by actions, which is the next thing that we're going to talk about. Has the behavior changed? If they're really sorry, they won't do whatever the issue was again or say whatever the thing was that they said. If they're really sorry, if they're really understanding what they did, their behavior will change. And this is a tricky one sometimes because some people think that, okay, the behavior changes, then you automatically should still be around the person. You automatically should, still see them or interact with them. And I don't necessarily know that I agree with that. I mean, an abuser can stop being an abuser, but that doesn't mean the person that was abused is really going to want to hang with them. So I think the behavior can change and you can accept that change and you can forgive them or release your resentment and anger about what they did. And then they go have their life and you go have yours and never the twain shall meet. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I don't think behavior changes necessarily need to always lead to face-to-face meetings or to a relationship. Now, obviously there are different circumstances and different kind of details that'll come in. I mean, if you're dealing with someone who had a drinking problem and did a lot of harmful things while they were drunk and then they get sober, you may decide, okay, I want to make sure that this is really going to stick before you let them back in your life. But if they demonstrate a pattern of changed behavior and have made amends, you may decide that, yes, you want to have a relationship with them. For other people, it may be, even if they totally change and become a different person, you just don't want anything to do with them. And you can forgive someone and not want anything to do with them. Forgiveness is not a blanket, I am open to whatever you want to do in my life now. Forgiveness is just, I am letting go of my resentment and anger about what you did. That's all it is. It doesn't have to be anything else. It doesn't have to be, I continue to want to have a relationship with you. It doesn't have to be, I'm allowing you to have part of my life. It doesn't have to be any of that. But like I said, there are different circumstances that may require a different assessment. Forgiving someone who is an alcoholic and is now sober is a little different than forgiving someone who sexually or physically abused you and has now gotten counseling or, got sent to jail and has thus stopped, we hope, or whatever it is. And so I think you need to take all of those situations individually when you're looking at, has the behavior changed? But the next thing I want to talk about is, have they made amends? And amends are big in 12-step programs. And amends are basically making a list of the people that you hurt and going back through that list and going back to the people and trying to, in some form, make it up to them. And that doesn't necessarily mean that, again, if you make amends, that person that to whom you are making amends is going to throw their arms around you and say, this is amazing and everything is forgiven and we're now the best of pals. That may not happen. That may never happen. You may try to make amends to someone and they may say they don't want to talk to you. And that's perfectly within their right. Because remember, you don't get to decide how you've harmed someone else. And you don't get to decide if their contention that you have harmed them is valuable, is not valuable, if is right, is true. You don't get to decide that. They do. And making amends is somewhat on the same wavelength as in terms of you can attempt to make amends to people and they don't have to necessarily accept that attempt. And they certainly don't have to say, well, you made amends, now everything is forgiven. And, life will just go on as though whatever the thing was or the things were that you did never happened. And that's a tough one for some people because I think, like forgiveness, amends have kind of become like this magic bullet. Like they're supposed to, you make amends to someone and they're supposed to just be joyous that you did, and then everything is good and the slate is clean. And it doesn't work like that, at least not for everybody. And I don't think it should work like that, honestly. I think making amends is a process in and of itself. And it should be a process for the person who caused the damage. Now, whatever reaction the person has who was damaged is a completely different thing. But I think for some programs and some people, amends have kind of become like, look, I said I was sorry and I'm doing something nice. So therefore, I'm now absolved of any responsibility for what happened. And, amends are basically about taking responsibility. They're about admitting that you caused harm to others and trying to fix it, which is kind of the definition of responsibility. Admitting that you did something and assuming responsibility is the only word I can think of, but assuming responsibility for the consequences of whatever you did. That's huge. But not everybody gets that. But I think it's an important part of figuring out forgiveness is, are they making an effort to take responsibility for what they did and fix it? That's really what amends are. So that's a good question. And then the last one, are you safe from danger or harm? Obviously, if someone was, beating you up, you probably don't want to go back to that person, even if they tell you they've had anger management courses and they've seen a psychologist and they fixed all their problems. You don't want to go back to them. Why would you take that chance again? If there's someone in your life that you just don't feel very good about yourself when you're around them, even if they make amends, even if their behavior changes, even if you understand why they do what they do, you still may decide that, you know what, I just don't like being around this person. I don't feel comfortable. I don't feel good about myself. I just don't want that energy in my life. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think what I want people to take away from this little piece that I'm doing here and this little discussion, if anything, is that forgiveness is not wiping the slate clean. Forgiveness is not giving people a pass. Forgiveness is not really even about the other person, honestly, which is a weird way to look at it because kind of the trope of forgiveness or the kind of historical definition of forgiveness is pretty much all about the other person. It's about I'm giving you a pass. I'm taking this thing that happened that made me sad or was painful or hurt me or whatever, and I'm saying it's okay, and I'm releasing you and absolving you of any responsibility for it. Which is kind of, when you think about it, a crap definition, because really it's compounding the pain that might have already been caused to you, which I don't think is fair. So I really, really like this definition that I found, which is an intentional decision to let go of resentment or anger. That's about you. It's about making your life better. It's about letting go of toxic emotions that could harm you. And to me, that makes a heck of a lot more sense, number one. And I also think it has more value. Because honestly, like I said in the very beginning, the people that hurt you don't probably have a lot of emotions about what they did to you. They may not even be thinking of it. Or if they are, it might be more in, it makes me uncomfortable to know that this person is out there and they feel badly about me. I mean, you can hope for genuine remorse. You can hope for really being sorry. You can hope for behavior changes. And if they happen, that's amazing. But I think you need to look at forgiveness more as, I'm choosing to release these negative emotions about this event or person to benefit me, to make my life better. And that is a version of forgiveness I can get behind. And that is a long-winded 45 minutes on forgiveness, but it was something I wanted to talk about. I felt like when I answered the question last week, I kind of rambled because I hadn't had a chance to put together any kind of coherent explanation. I'm not sure how coherent this explanation is, but I tried. And thank you, everybody that was here. I appreciate it. I hope you got something out of this. If you did get something out of this, I always welcome discussion on the Women in Business Facebook page. And I would love to hear what you think. And I will be back next week to talk about something else, or possibly to have a guest, because you never know. Anyway, thank you all for being here. I will see you all next Wednesday. Bye.